So let's review. We got plenty of time today to get through what we need to get through, I think. So let's do just a mild level of review. Okay. We look around the room again. Who's got the strongest muscles? It's one of the things that might contribute to who has the strongest muscles. Size. Okay. I was looking for somebody with big arms. Okay. Size. Good. What else? What else should we care about? Training history. Okay. Why do you think that's important for you? What specific physiological parameter might training history play some impact on?
Yeah, absolute strength.
Okay. But so like big muscles, this, and I guess if you train, you might have bigger muscles, so that would work there. But does it have an effect on something else? Like what's the second most important thing that we mentioned? For a second, it's a fascinating. We're going to come back to that. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. Architecture matters. Okay, good. Motor unit recruitment. Yes, good. Is there another sort of neural parameter that's kind of a corollary to motor unit recruitment that we think would be important? What do we finish? Okay. Good. So those are the things we talked about yesterday. How big is your muscle? What's the architecture or specifically the pination of that muscle? Okay. So how much actin and myosin do you have? What's the arrangement of that actin and myosin as it relates to the line of pull? And then how much of that muscle can you turn on? That's motor unit recruitment. Much can you turn on? And then the idea of firing rate or muscle activation, that firing frequency is once it's on, I can modulate how much force I get from those fibers by altering the number of actions. So those are kind of the things that we've covered so far. We're going to talk about a couple more today. But before we do that, I apologize, Abby. Is that right? Is it Abby?
Abby, yes.
Yes. Okay. I'm getting pretty good, but Abby said fiber type. Why do you think fiber type would matter?
It matters like the type of exercise or movement that you're doing. So
Okay.
like I think it has to do with like your endurance and those things like fast fit, like you'll be able to do things like quickly or like better, but like you're gonna like fatigue easier.
Okay.
And
Okay.
so
Okay. No, that's okay. This is a very nuanced kind of question. Do you guys think it matters? Show of hands. If I had a person up here, I could have. We have Destiny up here, and we have Destiny and her twin. Okay, Destiny, do you have a twin by any chance? No. Anybody have a twin? Abby, you have a twin? Like an identical twin?
no.
Okay. That's all right. That's good though. That's fun. As an only child, I'm like, what's it like to have brothers and sisters? So Destiny's up here, and we have Destiny. We're gonna make an assumption that I'm sure is wrong, that original Destiny has 100% slow twitch muscle fiber in all of her muscles. And then we have her twin. We're gonna clone her, right? Don't say that out loud. The legislature will get mad at me for suggesting those kinds of things. But we have her clone, and her clone has 100% type 2X muscle fiber. Okay? They're the exact same height, the same weight. Their muscles are exactly the same size. Everything is identical, except their fiber types are on opposite ends. Which Destiny will be stronger? Anybody want to guess? What do you think? Who's stronger?
You know, there's their own like capabilities.
But like if we said we're going to do a 1 rep max squat, they have the exact same lifting history. Everything is identical. All we've done is just lift their muscle. Avery, you said it depends. Why? As I told you last semester, it is always an acceptable answer to tell me that the answer depends. You just have to be prepared for me to then ask on what. So, Andrew, on what might it be?
Hybridize.
Okay, but so you think it matters? You think one of them would be stronger than the other? That's all right. Does anybody feel very strongly, one way or the other?
I feel like if we're gonna do a 1RM, things like two, like we're gonna do like 20 squats with lower weight and on, so just depending on what we're doing.
Okay, so let's take that out. 1 rep max. Okay, 1 rep max. Let's assume Destiny, do you squat a lot? Not very often. Okay, we're going to assume Destiny squats like 3 times a week. Okay, she has her own TikTok channel about how to do squats or whatever. She's very adept at doing squats, which means she should be very good at recruiting close to all of her motor units. Very good at sort of maxing out her firing rate within those motor units. To do a 1 rep max, if it's truly a 1 rep max, how many motor units do you think of your overall sort of, out of that 100% possible, how many do you think you're going to use when you do a 1 rep max? Maybe 90. If you're good, maybe 95 or 98. So fully 100% slow twitch motor unit Destiny would use 95 or 98% or 100% of the motor units. Also, 100% fast twitch would use the same percentage. If you're a mix, you've got some slow, some 2A, and some 2X, you're still going to be at that if you're good at it, 95, 98. So what I want you guys to, it's a good question here. So when we do very, very high force events, you're going to recruit close to everything that you have. That's why that's your max. If it wasn't your max, if you were at 80%, then we need to put some more weight on it. You can do more. Okay. And when we do a submaximal, you're doing 20 reps, you're going to recruit the smaller, normally slower ones first. So that's going to matter. But 1 off strength. I told you guys that 2X's tend to be bigger and stronger than type 1s, right? The other day. So do we think that 2X Destiny is going to be stronger than type 1? Slow twitch? Do we need to stand up and squat? Somebody will answer.
Yes.
Yes. Avery, pick someone to stand up and squat.
Sorry, you're just like right there.
All right. Danny, squat position. Hold it right there. Do you? Take your elbows off your knees. We're gonna sit here and Danny's gonna squat for you guys until somebody offers an answer.
Yes.
Yes. All right, stand up, Danny. Colin, what were you gonna say? Cross-sectional area is the same. Everything's the same except for the minus. Probably going to be the same. We can't actually experimentally test this, right? Because nobody is that way. Yeah, it's going to be very, very close. Much of the differences when we isolate out single fibers and we see that we get more force out of the 2X's, it's just because they're cross-sectional areas. If you look at the measure of force per the area, you get a parameter. You guys don't have to what we call it specific force or force per area of muscle. They're relatively close to the same. So, yeah. So fiber type is an interesting thing to think about. Like you would think, like, oh, right? People that lift weights are always only got a lot of type 2 fibers. Hey, not. Right? That's not actually a thing that's going to go on. Remember, if you've got a lot of type 2s, you're probably going to be a good sprinter. You're going to be a good jumper that we'll see in the next few slides. But it may not necessarily have that much to do with how like truly strong you are. Okay. Do I need to go back over this graph again, or do you guys remember? Remember what the graph is? Don, if I asked you to come up and explain this, could you do it? I mean, that's very flattering if you'd say that in some ways. So just remember, guys, every line is a motor unit. Okay. What we're showing is as force production increases, we can recruit a motor unit to get a certain amount of force, and then we'll crank up the firing rate in that motor unit. And then at some point, we're not able to get enough force, so we'll recruit a second motor unit. But it's going to start off firing at a lower firing rate than the one that was recruited before that. And we will do this and progressively recruit more and increase our firing rates until we're able to match whatever force that we need. Okay. So there's this interaction between those two parameters. That's two nervous system parameters to do things. Okay. Okay. I'm going to show you guys this, and I'm going to tell you why it's a lie. Okay? It's not really a lie. I'm going to tell you why it doesn't matter. So what we have here is some data and an illustration from a paper that was published in the mid-1960s on something called the sarcomere length tension relationship. Okay? Sarcomere length tension. What this illustrates for us is you've got a sarcomere, or we have a sarcomere here. You've got actin filaments, these little thin ones, and we've got our thick myosin filaments there. And remember, force production is directly related to the number of cross bridges that can be attached. And so, depending upon how stretched out or how sort of all the way contracted together a sarcomere is, that's going to have an effect on the amount of overlap of our actin molecule with our myosin molecule. Okay? So here at the top, we've stretched the sarcomere way out. And here down here at the bottom, we've contracted and shortened the sarcomere as far as it will go. And so at very long sarcomere lengths and at very short sarcomere lengths, we run out of overlap, the ability of the myosin to have binding sites on the actin filament. And then everywhere in between, there's going to be, when there is some overlap, we're going to get some force, and then there's going to be somewhere kind of in this middle range where we call this sort of an optimal length or an optimal amount of overlap because there are actin binding sites available for basically every myosin. So when you graph it out, force looks like this. Here's very, very short sarcomere, so the bottom. Here's very, very long or stretched out sarcomere here at the top. And this is the way the force graph is going to be. So out here, we get no force because there's no overlap. Down here, where it's very, very short, we get no force because basically the actins have slid all the way past each other and there's nothing left for us to bind up. And then we're going to be in this optimal region somewhere in there. Okay? So that's the idea of what's called the sarcomere length tension relationship. And I should have brought my weights. All right. Any volunteer? Anybody? Anybody want to help me? We don't have any weights. You don't even do. I'm just going to stand up here and be my guy. Thank you, sir. Okay. Ty, stand right over here. Imagine, if you will, Ty's going to do a curl for us. Okay. You don't have to yet. I'm going to hand Ty the weight, in theory I would, for him to curl. Okay? Now, Ty, may I touch your arm? Is that okay? I'm still going to get all this. Right? Do you guys think this is what sort of is going on with this bicep? Is this lengthened, shortened, somewhere in the middle? Lengthened. Okay? Relax. What's happening to it? Shortening, 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 shortening. There, as short as we can make it. Okay? Let go. If we give Ty weight, we say, you got to do a 1 rep max cardio, lift as much as you can. Okay. Do you think he can lift the same amount of weight here as he could if I let him come to right here and I gave him the weight versus if I let him have it all the way here at the top? Oh, you're saying no. Where do you think he's going to be the weakest? The bottom, so way down here. At a what sort of length of the muscle is that? Long. Okay. Long. Good. Long. Okay. Shorten, 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 shorten. Do you guys think he's pretty strong right here? Braden was yesterday, right? And what about as we come all the way up here? Maybe. Okay. Short, middle, or optimal, long. If I had weights, y'all are right. Okay. You are weakest out here at full extension. You ever done a curl? When you start to curl, right? You get to about 45 degrees or so down here. And if you can get past this place, you can usually do the rest. Okay. Think about when you do a squat, right? If I do a squat, you can get up from down here. If you can get to about 45 degrees of knee flexion, you can usually get the rest of the way up. Okay. What I've shown you guys is a lie. Okay. This is in a sarcomere. As we move Ty's arm, you know how much his sarcomere is actually moved? Not this much. Okay. All of you are going to spend like 90% of a range of motion. Like right in here on your sarcomere. Okay. This is a theoretical relationship that I can make happen if you let me cut out your muscle fiber. Okay. In intact human muscle, you are rarely very far away from the optimal sarcomere overlap. Okay. Now it's going to do, they're going to lengthen and shorten some, but you're going to spend most of your time kind of somewhere in this region where the change in sarcomere length isn't going to matter. Okay. However, that relationship that we just showed with is very real. Weak or weaker, stronger, and you actually are a little bit weaker again back up at the very, very top. The biceps, the elbow is kind of a weird one because you can't keep coming. You're going to get stuck up here. But this to this, that part's real. And if it's not due to this, what's it due to? Why are you weaker at full extension versus right in the middle? You are able to generate more force here than you are. And the weight is the same, right? Like the weight doesn't change. Why are you able to get more force here than down here? Out of the same number of motor units that are recruited, out of the same firing rate from those motor units, you will actually transmit more force here than here. Why? I was told that you could answer this question by your biomechanics teacher. Okay. Any of you that had biomechanics, you remember a moment arm? The idea of a moment arm? You'll talk about moment arm in anatomy? No, of course you don't. Physics? Anybody ever been on a seesaw? Start there. Ever been on a seesaw? Right? If you move the fulcrum of the seesaw, right? Like you can figure out like who weigh, like people that weigh different things, you can balance them as you move the fulcrum. All movement, okay? All movement about a joint is rotational. Okay? Is rotational. Angular movement, which means when the joint moves, right? I have muscle that does something, connects to a tendon comes down and inserts on a bone. force is actually applied from my bicep down here on my forearm, right, as it attempts to pick things up. As it does that, and I'm rotating at my elbow, this distance here, okay, it's the moment arm. And so, if I inserted it farther down, I would actually get, I have a bigger moment arm, I actually get even more force. So, in people, in our joints, you get whatever the muscle generates, and you have to multiply that number by the length of the moment arm, which is called, that gives you a parameter, torque. Torque is measured, it's the angular analog of force, and so torque is measured in something called Newton meters, which is force production from the muscle multiplied by the moment arm. And what I want to show you guys here, this is at the knee, okay? These are data taken from people having knee surgery by a guy who's at the University of San Diego. They do some wild, crazy stuff. This is your knee moment arm length as you go from full extension back to full flexion. Okay? Look what it does. At flexed, short moment arm, it gets bigger, then it goes back down again as you get out near extension. So this is what happens in almost every joint. Okay? You're going to get at long joint lengths and very short joint lengths, or at very extended versus very flexed joint lengths, the moment arms are going to be smaller than they are in the middle. And that's why you guys tend to be stronger somewhere in the middle of the range. It's just physics. All right, who have I confused? Okay. I'm just warning everyone, we seem a little dreary today, that we're gonna have to get up and play silly games again or something in order to do different things. Okay. All right. One of the last pieces here. And this is one of the things that's going to give people, when you think about fiber type, it's probably going to matter a little bit. So how big your muscle is matters, the number of motor units you can recruit matters, the firing rate matters, where you are in a joint's range of motion matters. All of this is mattering at the same time. Then the last piece that we need to concern ourselves with is how fast are you trying to move? Okay? How fast are you trying to move? This is again, a graph from the 1950s showing here's force production on the x-axis and velocity of contraction or speed on the y. So here's a very fast contraction. Here's a very slow contraction. So when we look at this, fast contractions, almost no force. Slow contractions, much, much higher force. A contraction that has no velocity whatsoever. What would we call that? Isometric. Here's an isometric contraction, even more. More force out of an isometric than out of, this would be a concentric contraction. We call this relationship the force-velocity relationship. And for concentric contractions, it's very simple. The faster you want to move, the less force you're able to generate. Okay? The less force you're able to generate. We'll get into the why here. To go fast, you get less force. If we had all of our weights again, you can move that 2-pound dumbbell very, very fast. You can move that 25-pound dumbbell significantly slower. You try as hard as you can, you probably can't make it go as fast. Okay? Why does this happen? Why do fast contractions lead to less force? It all comes back to cross bridges again. Okay? It all comes back to cross bridges again. In order to go fast, in order to move through a range of motion, I have to undertake the cross bridge cycle over and over and over and over again. So I have to make a cross bridge, generate force, break the cross bridge, reset the myosin head, and then go again. Okay? To go fast, have to do that very, very quickly. And the way that we get around all of that is the faster we want to go, we have to have more cross bridges that are detaching at any instant in time than when I'm going slower. So if I have fewer cross bridges that are attached, I get less force. Okay? So the reason that fast contractions don't give as much force, they actually use more energy because I have to break cross bridges. And it's the breaking of the cross bridge where I actually use the exit. So that's why sprinting is much more metabolically taxing to you than the slower go. So this has some interesting implications for training styles and different things. If you want to lift weights, should you lift weights slow? Should you try to lift weights fast? If you want to go fast, you can't lift as much weight. But we'll see kind of how we get this into power in the next couple of slides. Okay. Now, this is for concentric contractions. Eccentric contractions are weird. Hence the name eccentric. Eccentric. Okay. During eccentric contractions, in some ways, the opposite happens, sort of going from no velocity to kind of very slow, moderate velocities, and then it levels off. This is a graph that was put together by my PhD advisor well before I was ever in the lab. But the axes have been flipped on this one. Okay. Here we have velocity on the x-axis, and we have torque production, right? This is measuring knee extension force or knee extension torque here. So this midpoint line here where there's zero velocity, this is an isometric contraction, okay? The positive velocities mean we're shortening the muscle, so here's concentric, this direction. Isometric has more force than any of our concentrics. As we go faster, it's going to fall. And then this is eccentric over here. And it looks like this. Okay. You're going to get a little bit of an increase in force as you go from no velocity to kind of a slowish velocity. And then it just levels off. We tend to say that eccentric contractions are basically independent forces independent of velocity. You can go as fast as you want with a lengthening contraction and force isn't going to change. Force isn't going to change. And again, the reason that this happens is because it comes back to cross-bridge mechanics. Always about the freaking cross-bridge. When I do an eccentric contraction, I don't have to break a cross-bridge. It's not going to shorten. The cross-bridge forms. My external load is actually larger and weighs more than what those cross bridges can generate. So they're going to get pulled, right? They're going to get pulled in the opposite direction. If we lower something down, gravity's pulling it down, we're just resisting. So you don't have to break the cross bridges. You don't use energy. And it doesn't matter how fast we go, they're always going to stay attached, mostly. One other piece of this, though. You can actually get more force from an eccentric contraction than you can from a concentric or an isometric contraction. You can lower down more weight than you can ever hope to pick up. Why? Catherine, you want to do a favor for me? You stand up and jump and try to touch the ceiling. Everybody watch Catherine. Okay. Wait, slow motion, do it again. Okay, perfect. Thank you. What did Catherine do before she jumped? She bent her knees. Why, Catherine? Why did you bend your knees? Okay, you're right, sure. You can do better, right? If I let you go to like and do this, you get more force. What kind of a contraction are my quads doing as I start to go down? Eccentric, good. Okay? So I get force from skeletal muscle. Let's laugh at me, Todd. It's fine. It's good. No, I deserve it. It's okay. I can't jump. Where's the extra force coming from? A cross bridge can only generate so much force, whether it's concentric, isometric, or eccentric. It can only get us so much, and yet we're able to find some extra force when you do a lengthening contraction. Where does it come from? What is it about this that helps me? You want to try to answer? Yes. You are storing elastic energy when you stretch. So I go down, I stretch the epimysium, I stretch the paramysium, I stretch the tendon. They're rubber bands, right? When you stretch them, they hold elastic energy. And then when you let that go, when you then do the concentric contraction to jump, you release that energy and it can get some force from the force of it going back to its origin. That's why eccentrically you can do another 10, 15, 20, 30% of more weight than you can ever. You'll never have a problem lowering the weight down when you do a squat, or lowering the weight down when you do a bench press. Always the up portion that's going to be the problem. Again, it's all about how the cross bridges and the cross bridge cycle work. That determines force production. If the cross bridges don't have to break, what are they going to do metabolically? Don't have to break them. Are they going to use much ATP? No. How do you think running downhill is easier than running on top of ground or running? Because of this. I can get more force, and I basically don't use any energy to do it. That's why running downhill. When you run downhill, it's eccentric contractions in your knee extensors most of the time that are breaking you and keeping you from falling on your face. Okay? And so they're not very metabolically taxing. That's the reason. Again, it all comes back to the cross bridge cycle. Okay? Now, I like this graph. You're not going to be responsible for it, but I like it because it's attempting to show the combined effects, okay, of sarcomere length and contraction velocity. You can argue that it's not sarcomere length, that it's actually joint angle and contraction velocity all together, right? The key thing to take away from all the things that I've told you guys is that everything we've talked about so far works together. They're all happening simultaneously to figure out how strong you're going to be, okay? You have a certain amount of muscle. It has a certain architecture. You have an ability to recruit the motor neurons and turn on that muscle. You have an ability to drive it at a certain firing rate, but then the actual part of your task comes in, right? I can turn the muscle on, but what's my task? Is it a fast task? Is it slow? Is it isometric? Is it concentric? Is it eccentric? What joint angle am I moving it through? Okay? All of these things act together to determine how strong it is. When you go, if we went over to the huff, whatever we call it these days, we went over to the huff and we said, we're going to see how much weight you can squat right now. All of these things are going to work at the same time, okay, to determine what you can squat down and pick back up. Okay, it's not just those things. There's some physiology, and then there's some biomechanics or kind of movement physics applied on top. And that's what this is trying to illustrate. It's just, right, as velocities are slow, I get more force, right? So a slow contraction in a kind of optimal joint angle or sarcomere length is going to get me the most. But even if I'm in that sort of optimum joint angle, if I go really, really fast, it falls down. And so it's just trying to kind of illustrate how all of these things are going to work together. Okay, our last thing here. And this is where fiber type really matters. This is why I can't jump. Okay. Why I wasn't a college football player or a college baseball player at a higher level than what I was. It's this concept of power. Okay, power. Power is the application of force and velocity together. Okay. From a physics perspective, power is denoted or calculated by taking force production or load, you want to say it that way, and multiplying it by the contraction velocity. So if you need to jump, your body weight is the load. I need force to move my body weight, and I need to be able to multiply that by my velocity. So if I can generate more force, I can get more power. If I can go faster at the same force, I can get more power. And this is where fiber type. Okay. If you do a graph, here is sort of the concentric force velocity curve. Here is sort of decaying curve. But if you calculate power, which is just you take a given force and a given velocity and multiply them together, you get a power curve that is our dashed line. And what you will see is that most people have maximum power at about a third of max velocity. That's about where we're going to be. Okay? But this power curve and this peak power, whoever has the highest peak power can run the fastest, can jump the highest. Okay? Or very likely then can create the most momentum so that when I smash into you on the football field, or I got to try to knock you off the ball in soccer or whatever it's going to be, I win. Okay? This is something we can train a little bit, but a lot of this is totally dependent upon fiber types. Okay? And so I'm going to illustrate this with my left panel first. Okay? Here we have the power curves. Here's a relative power curve for a slow twitch type 1 fiber. Here's a relative power curve for a 2A. And in this one in the book, I couldn't find one that said 2x, so we're just going to call it a 2D, but this is a 2x. Okay? Which one of these has the most power? And this is the application of force and velocity together. 2x's have a lot more power, especially than the ones. 2a's have a lot more power than these. Okay? This was from a thing where they tried to do a taper, where they took athletes and they actually had them reduce their training. There was an old thing from about 30 years ago. They used to take sprinters. And remember I told you guys a couple of days ago that if you're super inactive, you may be able to get a little bit of your 2A fibers to turn into 2X's. They would take sprinters and make them couch potatoes for a month or 6 weeks before competition in an effort to try to switch their fiber type from 2A's to 2X's and get a little bit more power out of them. It doesn't work super well. You can get the fiber type conversion a little bit, but if you don't ever practice, some of this, the force application portion of the power curve, is dependent upon recruitment and firing rates. It's dependent upon practice and your ability to continue to learn remember how to do those things. And so they found that even though you get a little fiber type switch, you lose some of your training and ability to recruit other units. And so it kind of washes out. Okay. This though is where people that have lots of type 2 fibers, they run faster, they jump higher, they're more what we would call explosive. Okay. Well, I can barely jump to do that. Okay. All right. Questions about that? So I told you guys the other day, fiber type, you should do a sprint test. We could also do a vertical jump. That would also work. We can bring the vertex up from downstairs, have everybody go out and jump. And those of you that per your body weight jump the highest, that's a reasonable chance that you have relatively more type 2. That was it for all of that. Okay. For our next trip, we're going to talk about the interactions in some ways of the sensory or afferent systems and the motor system. We call it efferent, kind of descending drive out of those things. Okay. You guys ever touch something hot? Pull your arm away without ever thinking about it? We're going to cover that and why that works. Okay. Have you all ever had the experience when you're exercising that it felt unpleasant? Yes. Julie's like, yeah. If it hasn't, you need to work harder. Okay. You need to work harder. I'll show you guys a little bit, not so much in this, a little more of a graduate level, but your body perceives and picks up input from your muscles, your cardiovascular system, your pulmonary system while you're exercising. And it integrates all of that stuff together in your brain that generates what you feel like. And then what you feel like actually can have some level of impact on the ability of primary motor cortex and then areas in the cerebellum to generate action potentials to make your muscles contract. You ever try to exercise after taking a test? You're just mentally worn out. It felt worse. It's because of this interaction of sensory and sort of brain-derived work factors impacting how much of a signal I can send to my muscles. So we'll talk through a little bit of this. Okay. And this is one of the primary areas that we study in my lab. It's going to be the interactions of one of these particular signals. Okay. We did this the other day, but I want to hit it again. Okay. We've got our two divisions of the nervous system. We have central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is going to basically be, right, the axons and things that lead out to our muscles on the motor side, right, which we're going to call, the motor side is also called the somatic system. And then there's going to be these sort of sensory divisions, which are going to pick up information from the periphery, bring them back in. And then there's the autonomic system that we'll hold off on and talk about a little bit later. But then the autonomic is technically considered a part of the peripheral nervous system that's going to be a little bit separate from the somatic. So we've got sympathetic and parasympathetic inputs. These will become really important when we talk about controlling cardiovascular function during exercise, and we talk about some of the hormonal changes that occur during or after a bout of exercise as well. Okay. So some brain areas, right? What you're going to see here, and I've tried to sort of put these out in our picture here, our fake brain that's kind of colored in like my daughter did it. She loves purple and orange. My dad's favorite color is orange, and so Papa loves orange, and so she'll color in orange. But we need to get this to Papa with everything. Okay, so we have, right, the cerebrum, which is most of sort of the areas up here. We have the diencephalon, which is going to be the areas in the middle. It's going to have the thalamus and the hypothalamus. This is going to be, the thalamus is going to be one of the places that our sensory information comes in and gets integrated and then shared with other parts of the brain. The hypothalamus, right, does a lot of stuff about homeostasis. Okay. It's going to drive control of body temperature, control of breathing. That information is all going to kind of come from there. Cerebellum, which is down here, you oftentimes think of as this part right at the very, very back, is going to coordinate motor control. Motor cortex is up here in the frontal lobe, okay? But then stuff that's also going to come in is going to get integrated. They're going to have some stuff from the cerebellum that's going to play some impacts. These things, and then there's the brainstem, right? The pons, the medulla, autonomic centers for respiration, and those things are going to be kind of integrated through there. And then the brainstem is also really, really important for how we perceive pain. We will not spend hardly any time on, even though it's one of my favorite topics. Okay. Now, we're going to break out then the regions in the cerebrum, so these kind of big areas up here, which you typically think of as kind of the sort of largest portions of the brain. Frontal lobe here in the front, that's the primary motor cortex. This is where a lot of sort of conscious thought and cognition and those things are going to take place here. Okay, it's going to originate in the front. Parietal lobe is this green area here. This is going to bring, we're going to bring sensory input up, and it's going to get sort of going to land in the parietal lobe, and then from there get integrated into what's happening in our other systems. Okay, got the temporal lobe, which is this blue area kind of down here on the sides. That's going to be auditory input. And then the occipital lobe, which is right back here in the back. If you ever whack yourself in the back of the head, it goes black for just a fraction of a second. It's because you hit your occipital lobe. But vision and stuff is driven from these areas back here. Okay. All I want you guys to be able to do is, can you identify this on something like this, and do you have a very basic sense of the kind of functions that we're going to derive out of this brain? Okay. My assumption is that in anatomy, and if you've had a psychology class, you probably had to learn like all of the different sort of regions and areas and all of that. That's, you know, that's great, but it's a little beyond the scope of what we need for our purposes. Okay. So we're going to focus a little bit on this kind of interaction between sensory and motor outputs. And so these are going to be signals that are likely going to arrive up through the spinal cord, through the brain stem, into the parietal lobe, and then they're going to get sort of have an interaction with the motor cortex and the frontal lobe. Okay. Nobody freak out about cranial nerves. You don't have to know all the cranial nerves or anything. But in the peripheral nervous system, right, there's 12 cranial nerves that connect to the brain. And then there's 31 spinal nerves that are going to connect with the spinal cord as we go up and down along our vertebrae. There's the sensory division and the motor division, right? Sensory division has what we call afferent signal. It takes things from out in your environment and brings them back in towards the body. Brings them in and up to the brain. The motor division, which is going to hold the autonomic side, what we've been talking about is really the somatic side of this. It has what we would call efferent signal from the central nervous system out to the muscles. Okay? Efferent is out, afferent brings things in. So we're going to look at this interaction between what am I sensing from my afferent fibers and how is that playing a role in what my efferent signals are actually able to do. Okay? If you don't have this, you can't exercise. You can't stand up, you can't walk, you're going to fall over, you're going to lose your balance. Right? You have no way of knowing or monitoring how difficult the exercise bout is, what your metabolic stress is, what your cardiovascular stress is. All of this stuff is happening all the time. Okay? Okay. Central nervous system gets signals from all over the place. Internal organs. Right, you guys ever had internal organ pain? Anything? No? Anybody's ever like twisted your small intestine or anything? Anybody ever had it? We'll talk about in the cardiovascular system, had what's called angina pain, heart attack pain over here, right? It's an internal organ, but you're projecting the pain to someplace else. But you get information from internal organs, from connective tissue, and then you get a bunch from blood vessels, skin, and muscle. Okay, blood vessels, skin, and muscle. You have certain kinds of sensory receptors that are going to be located all throughout these. Okay, the receptors are going to fall into kind of some rough groups, and we'll talk our way through what each one of these things are going to be. Okay, everybody, take your dominant hand, put it out in front of you with your finger, press. Touch yourself on your other arm. You feel that? Okay. Because you can feel it, you are activating what are called mechanoreceptors. What we think of as touch is actually the perception usually of pressure. Okay? It's pressure. I press on there, there's pressure. It activates a mechanoreceptor and it says, hey, something's touching me. Right? Touching. It's in this location, it's this big or this small, that kind of thing. Those are what are called mechanoreceptors. You also have another kind of mechanoreceptor that is very sensitive to stretch. Okay? We'll talk about those in a little bit more, a particular one in a little bit more depth in the coming slides. All right, let's do Mr. Miyagi. You guys know who Mr. Miyagi is, right? A very formative movie of my youth. Okay? Rub your hands together. What does it feel like between your hands? Warm. Does it feel a little bit warm? Friction, warmth. You're activating thermoreceptor. Okay? That's right. We're going to do this one and then we're going to fix things. You're activating thermoreceptor within the muscle or within your skin. Okay? Thermoreceptor. There are also what we call chemoreceptors that are sensitive to different ions. They're sensitive to changes in ADP levels, to inorganic phosphate levels. They're sensitive to potassium. One of the ones that's the most common that you're going to experience during exercise is ones that are sensitive to hydrogen ions. Okay? They're called ASIC receptors, ASIC receptors, but they're sensitive to changes in pH. They're acid sensing ion chains. And so as you run anaerobic metabolism and you make lactic acid, the hydrogen ions that dissociate from lactic acid will bind to those ASIC receptors. And guess what it makes you feel like? Shit. Right? If you've ever done exercise and felt like you have muscles that are burning, right? Very sharp kind of burning sensation, not dull, not achy, but it burns. That's chemoreceptors being activated by hydrogen ions. We'll learn next week, hydrogen ions are the death of exercise. Decline in pH messes everything up. Myosin ATPase doesn't work. You can't release calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Like you mess up everything in aerobic metabolism. They're a real problem. Okay. But one of the things that they do is they lead to perceptions. There are things that are called nociceptors, which cause pain. I really should change the way that this is laid out, but there are nociceptors, right, that are sensitive to all of these other things that are up here, right? You have nociceptors that are sensitive to pressure, right? You can press, like I feel it, but if you press hard enough, you're like, ouch, that hurts. It's warm, but it's not painfully warm, but it might be at some point. Or it's cold, but it's not painfully cold, okay? Any cold plunge people in here? Yeah, Kirby? Every day? 3 days a week? Are you a Huberman podcast listener?
Yeah.
Okay. We're hunting that dopamine. Okay. It will wake you up in the morning, folks. It will. Right? Any hot tub people? Any sauna people? Or do you sauna as well? The sauna's better for me. Scandinavian countries, they go to the sauna like every day. Or Eastern European countries, the rates of cardiovascular disease are like half of what ours. They also have way more activity. But the sauna is also really nice. Okay, so but you have nociceptors to all of these things. Okay, you experience these things. There are chemicals that will cause pain. There's hot and cold that causes pain. There's touch and pressure that causes pain. And then photoreceptors are what are in our eyes that receive light. You can have painful amounts of light. Okay. So you have very little control initially on how these things work, right? Very little control. Touch, 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 right? You can perceive that it's touch. Once it gets to your brain, then your brain interprets those activation of those receptors as that is touch. Great. Now you got to figure out what to do about it. Is it touch that you like? Is it touch you don't like? You want to pull your arm away? Do you want to leave it there? Maybe you want to pull it away, but you're like, I'm going to leave it here because I'm going to come in. So you have some level of voluntary control in some instances with these things. Okay, so the process of all of this, the activating of all of these sort of sensory inputs, okay, we don't have much control over unless we do something wild. Who's been to the dentist? Have I been to the dentist? Went today, Michaela. Hey, did they inject you or rub stuff on your gums? Okay. You do, how numb are you still? You can feel now? You're walking around like this earlier?
Yes.
When you get a local anesthetic, all they're doing is they're basically either going upstream or at these things, they're making it where you activate these receptors and they can't signal on like back to the central nervous system. Or you can hyperpolarize the receptors themselves to such an extent that you can't ever get enough activation to get them to fire in action. Everything you perceive as hot, cold, touch, whatever it is, all it is action potentials from the activations of receptors that your brain then meshes together and generates a perception. That's all it is. All of your thoughts are just action. Okay? It's crazy. We're a stack of protein and water that signals with action potentials. We get all of them. Okay? I don't know. It blows my mind every time. Physiology is the best. That's what we've got here. Okay? And that's how these things are going to work. Okay. So let's talk about how this manifests itself in exercise a little bit. Okay. Hannah, stand up, please. Can you close your eyes for me? Okay. Would you be okay if Julia spun you around? You spin around. One more time. Stop. And what direction are you facing without looking? Okay, because you can hear my voice. Okay. Now, do you think it would have been easier if we don't talk, if you had your arms out to sort of feel where you were in space? Would you have had any better sense of where you were? Okay, what would have happened if you had your eyes closed and we had just picked you up and like flipped you over? Would you know you're upside down? Okay. You guys know when you put your arm up, you know where your arm is in space, right? Okay. Kelly, did you know where your gums were in space after you had the anesthetic? Not really, right? So we have receptors in our joints. Okay, they're called proprioceptors, and they're going to give us sensory input about our position in space. Okay, our position in space. These are called proprioceptors or kinesthetic receptors. They monitor joint angle and they sense your position. Right? My daughter's favorite thing is for me to grab her and flip her up onto my shoulder and then spin her around and those kinds of things. She enjoys whatever that kinesthetic sensation is. I don't like that. I get basically motion sick in the bathtub with everything. And so you put me on a swing now. She wants me to swing with her. And I'm like, I'm out. Like it's gotten really, really bad. I was fine when I was younger. Now I get really thrown off. Okay. You can have disorders of perceptions of space. So you're going to get, this is peripheral stuff. You also have the vestibular system that uses stuff in your ears, and it's going to also integrate. Okay. One of the reasons that we need to know where we are in space, then the muscles also have a way to monitor how much force they're generating and how stretched or shortened they are. But they do this in an effort to try to monitor and adjust force and to prevent injury. Okay? And to prevent injury. So we're going to talk about a thing called a muscle spindle. We're going to talk about a thing called a Golgi tendon organ. We have our kinesthetic receptors there. And then a lot of our other ones that are going to bring us additional sensory information are going to come from what we call free nerve. Okay? Free nerve endings are generally, you've got some in your skin, which we call cutaneous free nerve endings. You guys may have learned about them in anatomy or in physiology as type 4 afferent receptors or afferent signals. I was like, no, I don't remember that. No? Okay. You need to email Cindy and ask. And then there's also some what we call type 3 nerve endings as well that are going to be out. But they're going to be in the skin, in the muscle, around joints, around blood vessels especially. And they're going to provide information about hot, cold, touch, pressure, chemical environment, etc. So all of these things are going to be in our muscles, and they're going to send information back, right, up the brainstem to the parietal lobe, which is then going to interact with the motor cortex. Let's talk a little bit about, I think spindles are the first ones that I have. Okay.
So like those previous receptors, do they work with those receptors already?
Good question. Okay. These receptors here, it's complicated, but in general, what I've shown you guys, these things here, you're going to have free nerve ending or type 4 afferent nerve endings in your skin, in your muscle, around blood vessel that are going to be sensitive to all of these kinds of things. Okay. Then there are some additional specialized receptors that are not free nerve endings that are going to sense stretch in the spindles, force from the Golgi tendon, okay, and then position from the kinesthetic ones or the proprioceptors. Even though, right, what they're going to sense is pressure or changes in things. They're going to sense some of the same things, but they're considered a slightly different class of all. That's a really important distinction. Thank you for asking. Okay. Muscle spindles. You have in your muscle fiber, in your muscle, you have your normal fibers we've already talked about, okay, which are called extrafusal fibers. And then you have a collection of these, what we call mini fibers or spindle fibers that are called intrafusal fibers. So you've got a muscle, you have your regular muscle fibers, and then integrated all throughout that muscle are these specialized ones called muscle spindles. A muscle spindle is a mechanoreceptor. Okay, so it senses sort of mechanical movement and things. And its job is to sense muscle length. Okay? You activate a muscle spindle by lengthening a muscle, stretching a muscle. Okay? Spindles are interesting. We could spend like an entire week talking about them because they have both sensory innervations, so they sense stretch, but they also have their own motor neurons. They have their own motor innervation through what we call gamma motor neurons. And so what they can do is they can sense a change in length, and then that little intrafusal fiber can contract by itself and change its own length, which then changes its sensitivity to any further change. It's wild. Okay. What you guys normally know about muscle spindles is probably going to be this. Should have brought the hammer from the lab. Okay, you guys ever had that? It's called the tendon tap reflex. Okay, what I'm doing, tap the tendon. Tendon pulls and lengthens my knee extensor muscles, which activates the muscle spindles. The spindles sense that lengthening, they sense that stretch. Doesn't take very much from doing that. And then it activates a reflex, which we'll talk about in a second. But what's happening is, as we monitor stretch, as a muscle begins to stretch, we are programmed to think that's dangerous. Okay? If I stretch a muscle too much, it might tear, it might break. Okay? And so the body's innate response to sensing stretch, as this gets sort of pushed down as it stretches, is to signal back to the spinal cord, directly onto the motor neurons that go to that muscle. It bypasses the brain and it says, hey, motor neurons in this muscle, y'all need to give us some more force because we're getting stretched out. So what happens, it stretches, it fires to my motor neurons, they then reflexively fire back down, and I get force to try to kick my leg out and shorten that. That's what the tendon tap reflex is. And it's driven by muscle spin. anytime you do anything where you stretch a muscle, run, you walk, you jump, you lift weights, you move your arms overhead, you go to Pilates class, whatever it is, okay? You activate these spindles and they give your body information about the state of lengthening versus shortening of that muscle, right? And most of the time when you're actively moving, like I can be generating force in my muscle and you can tap my tendon and nothing happens. It overcomes the reflex activation. So you're not really getting the reflex activation unless you're super relaxed. But it's going to give us information about all of it. And it actually helps us generate more force in a muscle because we're programmed to think too much stretch is bad, right? Too much stretching is bad. Okay. So this is a reflex. You guys learn about reflexes in physiology? I don't even know what question. Yeah, a little bit. You remember a little? Yeah. Okay. So a reflex is in essence a pre-programmed motor pattern. It's a pattern of activating motor neurons to elicit a certain muscle action that does not require input from the brain. And it does that because that is fast. Okay? It's fast. We don't have time to send a signal to the brain and think about what's going on and then signal back down again. Okay? We'll talk about a couple more later on, but when you touch something, you activate what's called the cross extensor reflex, where I'm here, pull back, and you extend on the other side. But it's this reflex action of pull away from something painful or whatever else. So what happens with the spindles is you stretch, the spindle gets turned on, it signals via an afferent nerve to the spinal cord. I do want you guys to know what that nerve is. It's called a 1A afferent nerve. One A afferent. Okay. The 1A afferent, let's just imagine this. Okay. Sorry, this is a muscle. Okay. Here's its axon. There's its motor neuron in the spinal cord. Okay. In the muscle, there's going to be some little muscle spindles. We'll just make them look like this. You activate them. They signal back like this. They're going to signal back into the spinal cord. Okay. And these 1A afferents are going to directly synapse on the motor neuron pool for that muscle. And they tell that motor neuron, hey, fire. We've got motor neurons that aren't firing, fire start. If you're already firing, fire more. Okay. That's how this works. This is this reflex. It comes from here, back up, and then it turns around and it goes back. Okay. Back, we get a change length. We had more time, we could talk then about spindle gets activated, and that sort of sensitizes it to a certain amount of stretch. It signals back to this motor neuron, but it also synapses on some other motor neurons, the gamma motor neurons, signal back out and tell the spindle fiber to change its length and become more or less sensitive. So anybody ever been on a vibration plate or have localized vibration on you? Okay. Any of you have? Okay. When we put you on the vibration plate, we basically trick your muscle spindle. It vibrates them, and what happens is you change the length of the spindles, and so they become much less sensitive to stretch. And that's why you're much more flexible after you've been on the vibration plate. Okay, so that's what's happening here. Now let's talk about a Golgi tendon. I'm sure if we were to look, we could find a YouTube video of somebody trying to do a squat and like they blow their quad out. They do something while they're doing it. Okay. Well, their Golgi tendon didn't work very well. Okay. Golgi tendons, rather than sensing stretch or position, they sense force production. Okay. They sense force production. And their job is to prevent excessive force production. Excessive force. Don't lift too much. It might make your muscle explode, tear it apart. Okay. And so they monitor force. They're going to live in the sort of musculotendinous junction, that area where the muscle is we're going to start to kind of narrow the muscle down and have all of our epimysium and stuff kind of begin to go into and form tendon. And what they are is they're these little sensory neurons that are going to be intertwined with the collagen fibers in the tendon. And so when you contract and you generate force, this tendon is going to transmit that force, and it's going to pull a little bit, and that's going to squish. Those sensory fibers. So the Golgi tendon does the exact opposite of the muscle spindle. Okay, when the spindles sense length, they tell the muscle to contract more forcefully. When you activate the Golgi tendon, it says, "Ooh, this is bad. Shut it down." Okay, shut it down. So reflexively, Golgi tendons tell the muscle that is actively contracting to turn off, and it tells the antagonist muscle to contract. So you're doing a lot of knee extension, very, very heavy. Activate the Golgi tendon. It's going to say quads shut off, hamstrings turn on. And the whole idea then is you're going to basically drop off all of that force production in the quad, and we're not going to hopefully tear anything. Okay? So it inhibits the muscle that it's located in and activates the antagonist. And that's how we try to protect ourselves from excessive force and excessive stretch. Okay, so we talked about reflexes a little bit. And so then there's this other idea then kind of at the very, very end about sensory motor integration. So we use all of this at the same time. You're getting reflex activation of the Golgi tendon, reflex activation of the spindles. You're sensing your place in space. You're sensing the chemical environment from metabolism in the muscle. You're sensing how much blood flow is going there. You're sensing what your heart is doing, what your lungs are doing. All of that information is going to get transmitted from the periphery back up the spinal column, through the brainstem, into the parietal lobe, and then it can interact with what's going on in the motor cortex. Okay? Every time you exercise, you're making a conscious choice to do muscle contraction, right? Other than what I did yesterday with the stem. Okay? You're choosing to do this. And sometimes all of this information is too much, and you don't like it, and then you choose to stop, or you choose to slow down. Or you may sense all of that and like, I'm in a race, and this sucks, but I'm going to push through. So you'll do that. Like, oh, I'm starting to get tired, and this kind of hurts, but now I gotta try harder. Okay, so all of this information is going to get involved. Can I tell you guys a funny story about this? Anybody drive on 35 now? Something to do with the thing. Anybody drive on 35? See all the new billboards about fentanyl? You can buy naloxone basically over the counter. It's great. There are research uses of fentanyl. Is maybe a cautionary tale. I have a friend who is he's a faculty member and a scientist at the University of Utah. In their med school, and they will have an anesthesiologist come in and they will inject fentanyl into the spinal cord. They basically give people a nerve block. And then they will have them exercise. And so if you go in, right, if you go in on the dorsal side, you can inject just the fentanyl just on the dorsal side of the spinal cord, and you can just knock out the ability of those sensory sort of neurons in the spinal cord to pick up that afferent information back in. The motor side still works fine. Okay? You'll feel great the next day. And they will do this, and they'll have people go and exercise. And it talks about the usefulness of sensory motor integration. These people will go out like a freaking house afire. Like they'll be like, you're gonna go run a 5K. They don't have them run, they have them bike. They're a little weak or not a little wobbly from all of this. They'll have them do a bike like a 5K or a 10K on the bike, and they just tear ass out of there. Because they have no ability to be able to sense how hard they're working. So they just go like, I feel great. And they go hard, and then like halfway through, they're just done. And they have to slow way down because they have no ability to understand and appreciate what's the metabolic cost of this, what's my cardiovascular system doing, all of the things that you guys do, right? When you think I gotta run from here to, I don't know, like let's say you're gonna run from here back to your apartment. You know, okay, it's about this far. If I start off going too fast, I'm not gonna make it, I'm gonna have to, so like you do all of this sort of calculations in your head and then change your pace while you're going based upon what it feels like. Based upon like, yep, I think that's about right. All of which is based upon past experience. My daughter has no sense of pacing herself. No sense. Nor does the basset hound that's still alive, nor does True. They go until they're just dead. It's just go, done. There's no like, here, slow it down, man. It's just all gas, no brake. That's my dad likes to say. And so part of this sensory motor integration is it helps us when we exercise to understand sort of how much gas are we giving it, how much brake are we giving it, do we need to monitor those two things. And this is going to become really important when we talk about a concept next week called central fatigue. Okay. Central fatigue is basically when you choose to stop doing it. Which I can make an argument that every time you've stopped exercising or you've had to slow down, it's always just a choice. None of you probably really exercise to the point where you just like, my muscles are in a complete state of tetanus, I can't do anything, right? You've chosen to stop. But a lot of that's based upon this. So people that are better at this, oftentimes are better at sort of being parents. Or if we can give you things that aren't quite fentanyl, that might limit a little bit of this and make it a little bit more comfortable, and caffeine, then I did not say caffeine is fentanyl. We were very clear about all of that. Okay, but we can do those kinds. Right? So nobody needs to get a fentanyl injection. Please don't do fentanyl. Please don't. Anybody ever had a nerve block? You had surgery or something? Had a nerve block? It will oftentimes. Danny, what did you have done? You mind me asking? Okay. So they didn't push you all the way out to do it. Oh no. You were knocked out. So there are some surgeries where they'll give you the nerve block and they'll keep you awake. So I had one of my former grad students had compartment syndrome, and they went in and they cut basically the fascia around his tibialis anterior on both sides. And they gave him a nerve block because they wanted to make sure that he could basically try to plantar and dorsiflex while they were doing it to make sure they didn't fuck it up too bad. And they gave him, they would do the nerve block, they would do injections. Anybody ever had a corticosteroid injection in there? Kelly, you have? Okay. I've had several of those for some pain. It's the same concept, right? They will do something like that. Because when you have yours under, they give you a little bit of general anesthetic. When I had mine done, mine were in my neck, they would give me just a little bit. You're just like barely under. And then the anesthesiologist, they put an x-ray over there and they guide and give them the x-ray right in. No.
Right in my back.
Really? Okay. So, same. No. Okay. You guys ever get it's basically like an epidural. An epidural is a nerve block. Yes. Ladies, if you ever get an epidural, my wife wants me to tell you that you should take the epidural. Don't be a hero. And you get far enough along, you're like, I'm gonna do this, and I go, this really sucks. Sometimes you get too far along, they can't give you the epidural. She got the epidural and it spooked Ellis, and Ellis squinched down on the umbilical cord. And so, like within 20 minutes of getting the epidural, they had to do a C-section. And so, like the nurse is like looking at the heart rate, the fetal heart rate monitor, and it's like something, and then like wanders out and goes to to get her OBGYN, and she comes in and she's like, no, we're going right now. I'm like, what the hell's happening? I'm like, why are you, like, you're wheeling my wife out. I'm like, what's going on? Somebody talk to me. That's an epidural's the same. You can keep some level of motor function, right? But you can block this. So we talked about coordinated movements. I don't really know what else to try to tell you guys. There's not a lot to talk about with this because, again, in some other departments, they have a class on what's called motor control. In kind of more traditional kinesiology departments, they talk a lot about these kinds of things, like how does the motor cortex function? Like this is the area where we decide to make a movement, right? There's what we call the premotor cortex, which is where these things start. So when you learn how to do something, you actually sort of remember it in the premotor cortex, and then that lets the motor cortex do a better job of activating the right motor neurons in the right order at the exact right time. You have what are called basal ganglia, which are going to be part of the cerebral white matter. These are going to help initiate sort of sustained repetitive movements. These are going to be really important. The basal ganglia play a big level of posture. And oh God, I used the word muscle tone. Who said tone? And I scolded you. Who was it? Bailey? Okay, Bailey's not here. Okay. So this idea of muscle tone means like a level of sort of tonic contraction. Right? Not do your muscles look defined or not. The better way to describe that is you are lean, you do not have subcutaneous fat over a muscle. But this kind of muscle tone, when we think of posture, right? Like I'm using, right, my erector spinae, right, some of my abdominal muscles. I'm using my soleus and my gastroc and my TA to help me maintain this posture. So there's some tonic low level of contraction that helps me maintain that posture. Okay. That's driven in some ways out of the basal ganglia. That way you can do this. So for a lot of movements and a lot of these things like posture, we don't want to have to waste cognitive sort of abilities, like having to think about how you're going to do this. You just stand and you don't really think about it, right? Unless you're really, really tired. Okay. So that's going to be a deal there. We've got stuff in the cerebellum. So back here, right, kind of right above the brainstem, that coordinates timing of complex tasks. And in this instance, a complex task is walking. Okay, very, very common. You've got stuff coming out of the motor cortex going to the motor neurons of many, many different muscles. And that's going to pass through the cerebellum, which is going to help us to make sure that we're getting the right amount to the right places at just exactly the right sort of time. It also helps to smooth out movements. And then the cerebellum is going to be one of the first places when some sensory information comes back in that compares your perception of the actual movement to what you intended. Okay. Make a dancing joke on all of this, right? What Dr. Black thinks he looks like when he tries to dance versus what he intends. What I think I look like versus what it actually looks like in those ways. But you ever like do stuff where you're like watching yourself in the mirror, and you're like, ooh, that was not quite the way that I wanted to. I gotta move this back over here. My elbow's leaking out when I'm doing something. That's a lot of that stuff is going to be help us be driven through the cerebellum. And again, we could do an entire course just on this sort of complex motor task stuff. Okay, I don't really know where to put this, so we're just going to put it here, and then we'll come back to it when we get into the vascular side. Sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are considered part of the peripheral nervous system. They're actually considered part of the motor side of things. But sympathetic is fight or flight. Okay? Fight or flight. It prepares us for acute stress or physical activity. Always. Probably how many think somebody try to stress out in class? Buddy in this row? Kyle? I'll set up on your desk. Sure. Can you guys already tell that we've evoked the fight or flight response out of Kyle? How do you know that? Oh, I didn't mean like that. I'm sorry. Just like in your chair. Let me be very specific. Okay. How do we know that we've evoked a sympathetic nervous system response? Heart rate? Do you notice? Are you like have heart rate monitor head over there? Evan?
Oh. It's fine, right? So.
Okay. He's flush, right? He has released epinephrine and norepinephrine. We've gotten vasodilation to the arterioles, take blood flow to his skin, right? This is in preparation for I might have to do physical activity. I better get ready to cool myself off. Okay. Stress response. We probably didn't quite sweat yet out of all of that. I don't know. But that would have been a response. His heart rate would go up. His cardiac output is going to go up. His blood pressure is going to go up. He's going to begin to try to send these things to the working muscles. Probably wasn't enough to start metabolizing breaking down glycogen in the liver, but maybe in the midst of these things. So there's a whole range of physiological processes that are going to be related to exercise, especially that are going to fall under the control of the sympathetic nervous. Okay, so epinephrine, norepinephrine, think, fight, or flight. Right? Blood flow goes to your muscles, cardiac output goes up, breathing goes up, blood flow goes to your skin. We'll talk about all of the mechanics of that this week. Okay, or maybe the week after, before we get to some of the cardiovascular stuff. Parasympathetic, on the other hand, is right rest and digest or housekeeping. It's the input that's going to drive digestion, kind of recovery in some ways. It drives urination. It drives us to try to conserve energy. It's going to drive the storage of glycogen, fatty acids into adipose tissue. It is driven by primarily acetylcholine, not at the neuromuscular junction, acetylcholine. Otherwise, lowers heart rate, constricts coronary blood vessels, so less blood goes to the heart, and it's going to constrict some of our tissues in the lungs. It's going to also then want to send blood to your digestive system. Absorption. We'll get into all of those things and how they actually work when we get to the systems. You're on, but I wanted to give just a very brief overview, and I don't really know where the best kind of place to put them is. So we'll put them here. Okay. Okay. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll do just a brief amount of bro science, and I'll turn you guys loose a little bit early. Okay.
Well, what about this?